When you're fed up with fighting food and your body, join us here. I'm Allie Shapiro, creator of the Truce with Food program and your host for Insatiable, where we explore the hidden aspects of fighting our food, our weight, and our bodies, and dive deep into nutrition science and true whole health. Fair warning, this is not your parents' health care. This is a big rebel yell to those who crave meaning, hunger for truth, and whose lust for life is truly insatiable. Believe me, freedom awaits.
Have you ever had a colleague, family member, or friend who smoked and was agitated close to their smoke break, or if they otherwise couldn't grab a cigarette? Or you may know someone who struggles with alcohol and has trouble resisting a or many drinks. Perhaps you have similar feelings, but they are directed towards cookies, chips, or other kind of carbs. We haven't labeled the staples of the American diet as an addictive substance for many reasons. On one hand, our agricultural policy and food production that revolves genetically altered crops that produce cheap carbohydrates represents a bigger lobby and more electoral votes than tobacco, whose powerful lobby allowed cigarettes to be marketed as a healthy way to relax and safe for years, including by doctors, despite widespread evidence to the contrary. In addition to not being regulated, the sugar industry gets an estimated $4 billion in annual subsidies, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers. On the other hand, lobbies and food politics aside, food addiction and consequences require a more nuanced approach than abstinence as is possible for cigarettes and alcohol. We die if we avoid food completely, and food is much more fundamentally woven into our culture and earliest memories than alcohol or cigarettes, which in all cultures are generally adulthood indulgences. Do you remember summers at the pool with Swedish fish, or warm, salty, soft pretzels from the snack shack, or holidays with grandma's amazing mac and cheese, or dad's famous mashed potatoes? Or, like me, Friday night Pizza Huts where you cashed in your book it reward for reading 5 books to a free personal pan pizza. Chances are, if you scan your memory, some of your best, warmest memories involve sugar, associating this ingredient with pleasure, celebration, ritual, and reward. And for the purposes of this season, by sugar, I mean what we think of as traditional sugar, like sodas, candies, cakes, and added sugar in processed foods, like salad dressing, breads, pretzels, and other salty carbs. On the flip side, your most difficult memories probably also involve sugar as a source of refuge. If, like me, after another day of being bullied and isolated from, quote, the cool kids at school, you found bagels in the fridge to eat and numb the pain of being othered. Or right before a spinal tap to see how far your cancer had spread, your parents took you to the pancake house to try and bring some sort of comfort during the scariest health scare you've ever had. And who can forget Snackwell's, a dieter's low-fat bonanza where we thought we could eat the whole box because it was low-fat, not realizing that all the sugar was making us hungrier and hungrier. Sugar has comforted most of us when we were isolated in the midst of chaos, or for many of my clients, it was a lift when being emotionally neglected. Food companies methodically and relentlessly advertise to make us trust sugar and let these processed foods into our lives in a way not only without a warning label like cigarettes, but actually in a way we now come to seek out. As a result, what was once only used in a way that we use spices today, a little dab will do ya, is now the staple of our collective diets. And while now it's recommended to limit sugar, food companies didn't create but can capitalize on our Puritan, Christian, and capitalistic narrative of sacrifice equals reward, to ignore the mind-body connection and the need for emotional intelligence and agility. Adding insult to injury, we as taxpayers are paying to make ourselves and the environment, which is degraded immensely with our monoculture agriculture focused on sugar, corn, soy, and wheat that will be processed into sugar, unwell. We're subsidizing ecological collapse and the resulting pandemics like coronavirus. The decline of our personal and environmental bodies has led to an overtaxed healthcare system that was never designed for the chronic diseases, which in large part driven by our food supply and its consequences. In this season 11 of Insatiable, we will look at how we as individuals and a collective can go to sugar rehab, physically and emotionally. We will explore how we arrived here, root causes of sugar addiction, if sugar is really addictive, and can we eat it moderately, and how we can move forward with sugar in its proper pace in our life, and what does that look like for you? Without further ado, let's enter sugar rehab together. Welcome, everybody, to Season 11, Episode 5 of Insatiable. Fix Your Period Cravings with Nicole Jardim. One of the main reasons my clients crave processed foods is cravings and eating out of control because of their hormones. Whether it's the sleep disruption caused by perimenopause, to PMS cravings, to the pain and emotional toll of endometriosis, they know eating well will help, and that processed foods exasperate the problem, that they feel like a necessary solution to their hormonal ails. I personally know I'm looking for chocolate in the afternoon if I didn't get enough sleep from, I think I'm back in perimenopause, or I have clients who go for Wonder Bread when they have a really bad endometriosis flare up. That's why I wanted to have integrated women's health coach and author of the new book, Fix Your Period, Nicole, on today to help us as part of our sugar rehab season and to process how to get to the root of our hormonal issues and correct them so the sugary and salty carbs siren is silenced. What I love about Nicole is rather than treating problems or symptoms, she gets to the root causes, which we're really big on here in this community, of what's going on in their bodies and minds. She passionately believes the fundamentals to healing any hormonal imbalance lie in the approach that addresses the unique physiology of every woman. Yes, no more cookie cutter, one size fits all solutions. Nicole is the author of Fix Your Period, 6 Weeks to Banish Bloating, Conquer Cramps, Manage Moodiness, and Ignite Lasting Hormonal Balance, and is the co-author of The Happy Balance, a recipe book filled with over 80 hormonal balancing recipes. And she's the co-host of The Period Party, a top-rated podcast on iTunes. So tune into that. And she's been called on as a women's health expert for sites such as The Guardian, Well and Good, Mind Body Green, and Healthline. Thank you so much for being here today, Nicole.
Hi, Allie. Thank you so much for having me. I was actually just listening to you with my eyes closed and thinking, I'm just going to soak all of this up right now because it sounds so good.
It does. And I was reading your book, and Carlos, who is Portuguese, was out and was like, Jardim, means garden in Portuguese.
It does indeed. I know. Well, my family is of Portuguese descent.
I told him that, and he's like, who is this Nicole Jardim? And I said, she's who I met up with at the Ace Hotel with her and her boyfriend several years ago. Or was it like 2 years ago?
It was in 2018. Yeah, it was like July 2018. Yes.
Oh yeah. And I was like, and you didn't come. And he was like, oh, he's like, I wish I would have. I was like, yeah, because she's awesome. And so was Hayden. So yeah.
Tell him hi.
I will. So the first, I was reading the book that I got, which was amazing. And after the first 10 pages, I'm like, why wasn't this in my health education class? Why? I remember learning about nothing or how to not have a baby, right?
Yes. We all learned that.
Yeah. But why was all of this not in our health education class? I mean, your book is filling in what I wish I would have had when I was 14, 15, 16 years old.
First of all, I'm so glad that you've just said that, because one of my biggest concerns when writing the book was that I didn't make it exclusively for any age group, that anyone really could pick it up and get something out of it. So I'm thrilled that you've said that.
I was going to say, because we think of period problems, right? They can start as young as puberty. I've had some clients who never had a real period until after our work together, and then finding your work and stuff like that. But then there's also perimenopause, which I'm kind of, I'm 41 and I kind of in and out of, I think, and having sleep disruption, which is why I talked about period causing sugar cravings. But I think that people don't realize this is information we need throughout 30 years of our lives? No, 40 years of our lives?
Yeah. I mean, the menstrual life cycle, it starts in puberty, of course, and it culminates it ends with menopause. And I feel as though from the very beginning, we're fed the story, or the lie perhaps, that periods suck and that they are always going to suck. And we are never really given the opportunity to like our periods, much less fall in love with them, or our menstrual cycles, or the inherent powers that our bodies possess. And as a result, we carry this story from the time we're really young to 30s, 40s, even 50s. Because how many times have you heard from a woman, oh, thank God I don't have that anymore to deal with? And that's the message I hear from women who are in their 50s and 60s. It genuinely makes me so sad, because I am a hardcore period lover, obviously. I wrote 400 pages of it. And I feel as though that was my story too. I was, I didn't think that my period had to suck necessarily, but I remember, first of all, being like a period psychic because I knew that it was coming. Like I could just feel it. Like I felt changes happening and things like that. And I had pads in my backpack and in preparation for this because I was so sure that I was going to be that girl who got her period in school. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. And I happened to wear a panty liner to school that day. So I was just like well prepared. And I told my mom about it at the end of the day when she came and picked me up, and she was so happy for me and whatnot. But that celebration and feeling of excitement around my period was really short-lived. And within a couple of years, I had horribly painful periods. They were really, really heavy. So they'd just gone from just like sort of the basic puberty period, which is like a period and then nothing, and then you get another period and you're okay, and to just having these debilitating monthly episodes. And I remember not wanting to go to school because I was going to leak through my uniform, which had happened to me a couple of times. And I was so traumatized by that. As a teenager, you may as well just leave the planet. Like it sucks. And so I remember that was my life. And the reality was that my mom had also had really terrible periods. So again, this is a narrative, this is a belief system that's passed down from generation to generation, even if it's unsaid. And as a result, she was like, well, this is just normal, I guess. And there's really nothing that I can do to help, or I don't think there is. And so I never saw a gynecologist. I never did anything like that, which I imagine I would have just been put on the pill anyways, because eventually when I did see my mom's OBGYN, she did put me on the pill at 19. And that was, a turning point for me in the sense that I suddenly felt like I had control over my out of control body and period. And that was a complete game changer. And so I think that, just to really circle back and answer that question, it's that we have been led to believe that periods are out of control, that our bodies are these mysterious things that really can't be optimally working or healthy without some kind of medical intervention. I mean, how many times have we heard that any period related issue, whether that's a heavy period or a painful period or no period, is an automatic prescription for the birth control pill as the solution. And so we're moving so far away from trusting our bodies and further towards distrust and downright fear of how our bodies work. And that is definitely not the answer either.
Yeah. So it's like, if we're told to distrust and fear our bodies, then when something goes wrong, we're like, oh, like a story told and believed, rather than, whoa, there's a discrepancy here of like, this is a symptom of other hormonal imbalances and other issues coming on, which is why I love this book, because it really explains in detail too. I love the nuance and context of like, you talk about there being no perfect period, right? So
yes.
So if there's no perfect period, then we really have to understand root causes, because everyone's normal will be different. And so what may look like the same problem on the surface, right? Like really bad PMS cravings could have different root causes for each person. And I think that's so important for people. I love that you said there's no perfect period, because I don't know, that's really important, I think, to...
I feel like we're constantly striving for perfection in our society, especially women. I mean, and you probably know this more than anybody, in my intake form, there's a series of questions on perfectionism, and almost across the board, everyone answers those questions with a, yes, I am a perfectionist in XYZ areas of my life. And I think that your period is just another thing to perfect if you have period problems and you decide to start working on them. It just becomes another thing for us to analyze or overanalyze and control. And I try to come back to this idea that, like you said, right, our bodies are nuanced, and we are, there is no one size fits all approach, just like there's no one size fits all period, because some of us will have, a 25-day cycle that is always like that. I have a friend who, for the life of her cycle is never going to be longer than 25 days. She's tried all kinds of things and she's perfectly healthy and normal and fine and has no other symptoms. And she's just like, I've got this 25-day cycle. Is that a little strange? I'm like, well, you just ovulate early and that's okay. And then for others, they have 33-day cycles and they want to get the 28-day coveted cycle. And I'm like, trust me, you don't actually have to be there. If you're healthy, don't mess with what's working. And we've been led to believe that there is this the sort of a period prescription, so to speak, that if we follow, like we will have these, perfect 28-day cycles that go with the full, we ovulate with the full moon and we get our period with the new moon. And and like there's no PMS. And, it's like all of these things that people are, they're sort of led to believe that that's true. And you can totally have periods with no PMS, but you have to recognize too that moods definitely change according to hormonal fluctuations. So you're not going to be the same that you were on day 5 that you will be on day 27. It's just not the case. So it is interesting because I do think it just becomes this thing that this is another thing we have to work on.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than bringing kind of a curiosity and because I think part of the problem, whether it's, if you're fixing your period or exploring your hormones, like with you or with me, it's people's relationship to food. Part of what you're unlearning is this mechanical view of yourself, right? Of like standardization, which is this is how we're educated, that we're basically widgets and we're only valuable, our body's a machine, input in, output out, calories in, calories out. Like it's so mechanical. And I think part of the healing process is, yes, the tactics of, okay, how do I eat? What are the root cause of my hormonal and period imbalances? And also, wow, I'm a lot more dynamic and multidimensional than maybe I've allowed myself to be, which I want to get to how that interplays with our periods, because you say you work on the mental stuff in a bit. But you talked about just now about us all having different cycles, us all having different types of mood variations. How overall, though, do you think sugar, and by sugar, I mean what we think of as candy and that kind of stuff, but also processed foods like salty carbs, right? People are like, I'm a salty person. I like chips and pretzels. I'm like, well, they're just salty carbs, salty sugar. But how does sugar overall exasperate our period problems, which I think of as hormonal problems? Because your period is, as you say in the book, a 5th vital sign. So it's kind of the state of our hormones. Or you can correct me if that's like an inaccurate metaphor. But I'm curious how sugar exasperates or contributes to the problems, or is even a root cause.
Oh, girl. I mean, I feel like sugar is one of the worst things that we can consume. And especially when it comes to our hormones and our menstrual cycles. And I'm sure people are cringing right now, but I think that also, at the same time, we have to allow ourselves a little bit of grace, especially right now, because life has been turned upside down for so many of us. And it's okay with whatever your diet is right now. It's okay. I agree that we all need to be focused on supporting our immune systems and taking care of our health as best we can. But I also recognize too that life is bananas. So with that said, first of all, I think what we have to recognize is what is sugar, because you made a good point there that people think of candy, they think of chocolate, they think of cookies and cake and all of that. But we're also talking about really any refined carbohydrate, right? Anything that's made out of flour, because it has the potential to tip your blood sugar over that threshold that is not healthy. And we can also talk about those salty carbs as well. So potato chips and French fries, all of them fall under the umbrella of foods that are likely going to spike your blood sugar up to an unhealthy level. And so blood sugar is the first thing. And so for anyone who doesn't know, your blood sugar is basically just, it's released into your blood. Essentially, it's sugar, glucose that's released into your blood after you've eaten a meal. And once it's there, insulin is supposed to transport that sugar, glucose, into your cells for energy, because, your brain uses glucose for energy. So it's necessary. It's just not necessary in abundant amounts. And so what's interesting is that insulin is a very powerful hormone. I refer to insulin and cortisol, the stress hormone, as these tier 1 hormones to help people visualize how they impact our health, because those two hormones I consider to be at the root of so many of the other hormonal imbalances that we have. And so if we can just address those things, then we will start to see improvements in the sort of trickle down effect. And when we're thinking about insulin as being this powerful hormone, it's interesting because it's connected in particular to estrogen and testosterone. So insulin plays a role in estrogen dominance, or what we call estrogen excess. And that's really just, in layman's terms, it's when estrogen becomes dominant over its sister hormone, progesterone. And when we have estrogen that's, dominant, or, we have estrogen that's too high in comparison to progesterone, we tend to run into issues like PMS, worsening PMS or PMDD symptoms, heavy, long periods, breakthrough bleeding, or spotting at different times of your cycle, long cycles where they're longer than 35 days long, polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, fibroids. These are all conditions that have a connection to that estrogen dominance. And what's interesting is that insulin in higher levels, or insulin resistance, which is another condition that can develop when insulin is high for too long of a time, it raises the activity of an enzyme known as aromatase. And this is responsible. So this enzyme is responsible for converting testosterone into estradiol. So essentially what that means is you've got high levels of insulin, and that can raise estrogen and cause this estrogen dominant situation to happen. And, so this is what's so amazing, is that your hormones are so interconnected. They're all communicating with each other in various ways, all day, every day. And yet we don't even realize that, this is happening below the surface. We've got this situation now where like estrogen is going up, right? So estrogen is becoming higher, or it's getting higher, and it's telling your hypothalamus in your brain that there's a lot of estrogen to go around, right? So basically your hypothalamus is then saying to your pituitary gland, well, don't send FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. And so that's a hormone that's produced by your ovaries in response to FSH production. FSH is sending a signal to your ovaries to tell your ovaries to grow these follicles, and your follicles produce estrogen. But when we have a situation where, there's too much estrogen already in your body, it might slow down that FSH signal. And so then FSH is basically just saying, okay, well, we're not going to send too much down to your ovaries. And so they might not get the signal, and you might have a situation where your follicle just doesn't grow. So it stops in its tracks, and then you don't have ovulation happen. And as a result, if you don't have ovulation, then you don't produce progesterone. So it's this whole trickle down effect that can really impact the health of your menstrual cycle, and we don't even realize it. And that is all from dysregulated blood sugar. And it's not to say that happens to everyone, but I've seen it happen to a lot of people over the years.
Yeah, I love it's like the good news and the bad news is that it's all connected. So if you get to the root, you can, get a lot of things corrected. But the bad news is those basic things can be really challenging with our food supply. And if we don't understand and us turn to those very foods when we're feeling tired, or it's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg. Like our period problems cause exhaustion, moodiness, which are also the reasons that we then turn to, sugar.
I know.
But then it's exasperating it. But I love that. I mean, I like talk about blood sugar all the time on the podcast. So I love that you basically explain that that's like the trap door, right? In a way.
Right. Oh yeah. That's a good way of putting it. It's so true. It is.
Yeah. And I'm curious, like, how does blood sugar balance like shift throughout the course of our hormonal years? Because I think of I feel like right now, again, I mean, I don't know if I told you this, but basically like I was diagnosed as infertile, and they said that I was in early menopause, most likely from the chemo, which is why they thought I would need IVF and a donor egg. And I ended up really working on my thyroid and getting my cycles back regulated because they were becoming longer. But now that I'm like 6 months out of pregnancy, I've only had one period since then, and my sleep issues have kicked up again. And I feel like I'm back in this perimenopause state, which again, also being 41 may just be it, or maybe I'm in menopause. I don't know where on the continuum I am, but right. I feel like my blood sugar was not as once I corrected it in my 20s, my 30s, it was pretty stable. And now that I'm my periods are more regular, as my mom called it, the change of life last night. She's like, do you think you're getting headaches from the change of life? I was like, yes. I was like, you mean menopause, Mom? She was like, yeah. But so and I know that part of the headaches and my trouble with sleeping lately, I mean, part of it's coronavirus, but I feel like it's also part of my blood sugar because I'm back in that state. So very long question, but how does blood sugar balance shift in terms of eating the right macronutrients and by macronutrients, I mean fat, protein, carbs. Mm-hmm. How does that shift in terms of in your 20s and 30s versus when you get closer to that end of menopause? Because I feel like I don't know. That's a personal question.
It's a really good question. And I think that it's multifactorial. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that your blood sugar actually shifts almost on a microcosm in your monthly menstrual cycle. So that's the bigger menstrual life cycle is sort of a bigger picture of that. But on a more microscopic level, so in that first half of your cycle, we tend to have a better blood sugar balance because estrogen is surging, and estrogen is actually an insulin sensitizer. So it actually helps you stay more stable, like it helps your insulin work better, essentially. And so you'll find that if you eat something that's sugary or maybe drink alcohol, you might not notice the effects of dysregulated blood sugar or unbalanced blood sugar. And just so everyone knows what that means, so you think about, and this is, by the way, stuff that's likely been perpetually normalized, but when you think about unbalanced blood sugar, you're thinking like crazy energy highs and crashes. So, 1 minute you're wide awake after you've eaten whatever that thing is that you ate, and then the next minute you can barely keep your eyes open and you need to take a nap. That's a sure sign, as well as sugar or caffeine cravings in the morning or the mid-afternoon or even after dinner. And then also too, like if you've eaten something that's messed up your blood sugar, you will likely feel really hungry about 30 to 90 minutes after you've eaten, instead of the 4 to 5 hours that really you should be able to go without eating after you've had a meal that's kept your blood sugar stable. And the other thing is that like dysregulated blood sugar 100% results in PMS type symptoms, and I'm sure we'll get there, but moodiness, meltdowns, that panicky type feeling, anxiety, all of those kinds of symptoms are a sign that your blood sugar is off. So if you are experiencing those, then that should tell you something. But in that first half of your cycle, estrogen is a great sensitizer for insulin. So you'll notice that. You might notice that your blood sugar is more stable. When you cross over the ovulation threshold and progesterone takes over, we run into two issues. First of all, many of us are progesterone deficient because maybe we're not ovulating consistently, or maybe we're lacking certain nutrients that will support that corpus luteum, which is the little follicle that your egg comes out of. And that follicle is what is going to produce progesterone for the second half of your cycle and would even support your pregnancy until the placenta takes over at like 10, 11, 12 weeks time. So that little tiny follicle, it's like a half a centimeter or a centimeter, I think maybe, on your ovary, has a really big job. And if you're not getting nutrients that will support that, or there's ongoing chronic inflammation in your body, or there's gut-related problems happening, that is all going to potentially play a role in the health of that corpus luteum and how much progesterone you're actually producing. So in that second half of your cycle, if you're low progesterone, you might feel those PMS type symptoms that are very similar to blood sugar imbalance symptoms, or your progesterone might be fine and you might still be prone to PMS-like symptoms or blood sugar imbalance symptoms that I just described, because progesterone is a blood sugar lowerer. So it will actually work to lower your blood sugar, which is not a bad thing. But if you eat too many foods that are triggering to your blood sugar in that time of your cycle, what's going to happen is it spikes up and then it crashes even lower than it normally would because of the higher progesterone circulating in your blood. And as a result, you end up feeling not so great. And the symptoms are even more exacerbated because you are already potentially like feeling a little PMSy to begin with. Your moods possibly change. So definitely pay attention to that. And then on the grander scheme, I feel like, blood sugar is influenced by multiple things, of course, right? So it's influenced by the health of our gut. It's influenced by what's going on with our microbiome, whether our gut is leaky or not, and, what kind of inflammation is happening in our bodies, and also by our livers as well. So your liver has, and your pancreas too. So the health of your liver and your pancreas. So all of these organs are basically playing a role in how well insulin works in your body, as well as how it transports sugar into your cells. And so if if there are issues with your liver, with liver detoxification, if your pancreas isn't working as well as it did when you were in your 20s, which tends to be the case if we have had imbalanced blood sugar for long periods of time and we're just going on this blood sugar roller coaster, then what happens is you start to notice these issues more. And without ovulation and without the soothing progesterone hormone, because progesterone is also anti-inflammatory, we tend to run into more problems, I think, in our, not necessarily our 30s so much, but definitely in our 40s onwards, when we're not ovulating as consistently as we were. And our bodies are just not as resilient as they were when we were in our 20s and 30s. So I do find that blood sugar is one of the most critical things to get under control, especially if you're in perimenopause.
Yeah. And it's hard because at least, I mean,
yes,
because your cycles aren't as regular. And like when you were talking about progesterone in your book, I'm like, I remember I had progesterone cream that I used throughout my pregnancy because I have a feeling that might have been why I miscarried when I was 37, especially if I was in perimenopause. And so I started using it the past couple of weeks and it's helped, I think, a little bit. Like my sleep has definitely gotten better. And
amazing.
I'm like, yeah. Cause I eat pretty well and I get sunlight. I mean, I try to do all the things. And so I don't like to supplement, but I'm like, if this is what's going to help me sleep, like I'm desperate right now between having a newborn and, and coronavirus. I'm like, and I eat a tablespoon of nut butter most nights before I go to bed if I feel like I'm still a little hungry, But that's interesting. Yeah. Because I think sleep, when you don't get enough sleep, then that exasperates sugar cravings as well. It's like this vicious cycle. So, but do you think does that shift once we're through the quote change of life, as my mom called it? I mean, does your blood sugar regulate after that?
That's a really good question. And I feel like I don't know enough about menopause and what changes happen in order to speak to it enough. But I would say that, I feel like this is an ongoing conversation that you have with your body forever. And that I don't know that there's any particular time in your life, aside from when we're younger and far more resilient hormonally, that we are, that we're able to get away with having imbalanced blood sugar as much as, that time. But later on, I would say it would be even more important. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure with the hormonal makeup, because obviously we stop ovulating. What really begins to happen is our adrenals take over. So they start to produce some of the estrogen and the progesterone that we would have produced when we were still ovulating from our ovaries. And so the thing is with your adrenals is that they're extremely sensitive to blood sugar imbalance, because when your blood sugar is first of all, when your blood sugar is high, it raises your cortisol. If your cortisol is high, it raises your blood sugar. So there's an intricate conversation happening between your adrenals and your pancreas. So, like if your blood sugar is low, for instance, that sends a signal to your adrenals to start producing cortisol to raise your blood sugar. So there's a whole thing happening. So that's why I think like when we get to menopause time, our adrenals really have to be in decent shape. And for most of us, that's just not the reality. And that's why I'm always on women in their 20s and 30s to do the best they can to take care of themselves, because we don't really think that is going to have any kind of domino effect on our health in our 40s and 50s, but it actually plays a really big role.
Yeah. I used to tell clients like deregulated blood sugar is kind of like sucker punching your adrenal glands. It's kind of like, boom, like, you know what I mean? Get a reaction. I mean, and they produce. And that's why, I've read that like women in America have like a lot more perimenopause, menopause symptoms than other cultures. That may be changing as our culture gets exported, but because of the stress that we're under, our adrenals are like, I'm tapped out, peace out, like I'm moving to Florida, I'm going to Boca, it's like I've done my job, I'm retired.
It's so true, I know. And that's just not the case.
Right. What's interesting as you describe about all these intricate processes is I want you to talk about how blood sugar health and our hormones then plays into thyroid health. Because one of the things I see, which is, again, if we come back to fertility, not that the period is only about fertility. That's like the patriarchal view of our periods. But I can't believe, when I look at my numbers for when I went to Western medicine, my fertility numbers were awful, which is why they diagnosed me that way. And yet I also have clients and friends and family who go and their fertility numbers are fine and they can't get pregnant. And I think one of the things that you really talk about in your book that I think is so important for people, get the book, it's amazing for so many reasons, but also you bring up subclinical hypothyroidism. And can you talk about how that plays into our hormones and sugar cravings, including making us tired and anxious, which continues then why we also eat sugar?
Oh, I know. The thyroid is so interesting to me because, first of all, what I find so fascinating is that every single cell in your body has a thyroid hormone receptor, which is why right. So that's why when we have thyroid problems, they express differently for different people. And we also, for the most part, feel generally so crappy because a low functioning thyroid just robs your body of energy and the energy just to do things, to have a life. And that's, one of the biggest complaints, as we know, with thyroid issues is that you just feel so exhausted all the time. And there's an incredible connection between our thyroids and our menstrual cycle and, of course, our fertility. And then there's the subclinical side of things. And so with the subclinical hypothyroidism, I'm fascinated by this because this is not something that's generally recognized in the conventional medical setting, which, I get. Like, I know that it takes time to get to the point where all of this stuff is included. But with subclinical hypothyroidism, essentially all it is like a milder version of full-blown hypothyroidism. And what usually shows up is TSH is slightly elevated and free T4 or free T3 are normal in most cases. And, what happens is we tend to feel a lot of the same symptoms as someone who has been diagnosed with full-on hypothyroidism, whatever the cause, but the tests are just coming back normal in most cases. And women are just set on their way. I mean, it's a huge problem because I think millions and millions of women are walking around just in an undiagnosed thyroid state. And as a result, they have a lot of period issues and they have fertility problems as well. And they can't get pregnant and they don't know why. Pretty much every naturopathic doctor I know is testing, is doing a full thyroid panel to determine if someone has an issue, especially if they're trying to get pregnant. But when we think about period-related issues, the thyroid is such an important piece of this. I think the first thing is that, most types of thyroid disease, so whether that's hypo or hyperthyroidism, they will disrupt ovulation because your pituitary, so that little gland in your brain, it's not able to, or basically what happens is it disrupts like prolactin, FSH, and LH, which are produced by your pituitary gland. And those are the hormones that play a role in getting your ovaries to release an egg. So if thyroid or thyroid disease is interrupting what's happening in your brain, and that's disrupting the connection between your brain and your ovaries, that's a huge problem. And yet we are not really aware of that. And then I think the other thing is that with hypothyroidism, it also diminishes the body's sensitivity to insulin, which is a huge reason why so many women who have PCOS also have concurrent hypothyroidism or some kind of thyroid disease. And this will further make, the estrogen dominance, progesterone deficiency even more problematic, because in women with PCOS, typically what happens is their cycles, they're not ovulating consistently. So that estrogen becomes even higher over progesterone and we run into major issues. So that's the thing that I think is so fascinating, is that there's definitely a conversation between the thyroid and the pancreas and the adrenals and the ovaries. And yet we're not really making those connections. So that's, that's one way that it's all connected.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That was like, again, it's like biology 101. I wish I knew.
I know, right?
Because
Me too. That was why I wrote this book. I was for my 20-year-old self who couldn't get answers. So I totally get you.
Yeah, because I feel like, and I guess also just to make it clear, what I was trying to also say in my comments was like, I don't know, because women's health is so understudied, I don't even know if we're all looking at the right numbers when it comes to fertility, and that the numbers can change and how dynamic. And so like all of us are just kind of forced to like figure it out as we go. And so
yes, right.
Well, to realize, I mean, that's what I worked with my naturopath. My TSH was like 3.5, which was considered fine, but I knew that was too high, and we got it down to 2.0. And I know that was integral into me getting pregnant.
Yes.
And so, yeah. And I know a lot
of that.
Yeah. And I mean, again, and if we look at sugar, people like eat sugar when they feel frustrated with their fertility too. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, again, I don't think it's anyone's fault. Like, I think everyone's trying really like the best they can with the education they've been given. And we also need to question, like, do we have the full picture of what we should be measuring?
Yes.
Like, again, and tracing it back to, I love that you talk about like blood sugar being so integral to all these other pieces. And sugar contributes to whether or not we have stable. And so it's like simple and complex at the same time, I think, in a way.
It's so true. That's a really good point, and I really like that, because I do say that often, that this is actually quite simple. Obviously, how the body works is very complex. There's no doubt about that. And we don't need to know all the things, of course, but it really is simple at the end of the day. Like, there are very few endocrine glands, and they are all communicating with each other in one way or another. And as a result, like, if you can just tie it back to your blood sugar, for instance, or your stress, you're going to start to see amazing changes. And with your thyroid, what's fascinating is that, like you said, the thyroid ranges, the test ranges are so vastly different between functional medicine or naturopathic medicine and conventional medicine. And that is what I think leaves so many women feeling like they're in this subclinical state, because like TSH, for instance, the optimal thyroid range for that is 0.5 to 2. And like you said, yours was what, 3.5?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so you would have been considered completely normal, whereas, you worked with someone who didn't think that. So as a result, you were able to achieve the goals that you had because you were working from a different set of numbers.
Yeah. And if I didn't know to ask that, I don't know if, like, I was hyper focused on that, which is why I sought out a naturopath in the first place. Like, I didn't know how to get myself there because I was doing all the like conventional things already, like blood sugar, all that. And I ended up having to detox, and I had like Lyme microbes or whatever. But like, I knew that I want people to realize, like, you have to be your own advocate, like, for this kind of stuff. Like, I knew that was an issue, but I then needed to get the support because I was tapped out of my own, like, I didn't know what I didn't know, in a way,
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to ask you, and I hope, like, one of the things I'm learning about is trying to unlearn, I don't think I'm fat phobic consciously, right? But we live in a fat phobic culture. And one of the things that I'm trying to tease out more and more is that sometimes we have a real health issue that leads to weight gain. And sometimes weight gain is just neutral and it's not an issue at all, right? Or like, we're in bigger bodies and that's fine.
Right.
And you talked about estrogen dominance earlier before. And in your book, you talked about the more body fat you have, the more estrogen you'll have. And you said that women who are overweight are more prone to conditions related to estrogen dominance. And that's why weight loss can improve both insulin resistance and estrogen dominance. And I want to also kind of circle back to people. When we say insulin resistance, part of like the metaphor I give to clients is like, your cells are wearing headphones. And the more insulin resistant you become from deregulated blood sugar, from, as Nicole described, thyroid issues, all your period hormones, like, it's almost like those headphones, like the music gets turned up louder and louder. And basically glucose it's harder and harder to get into your cells. And that insulin resistance isn't always caused by like food alone or like weight gain alone. And so do you think estrogen dominance can cause weight gain, not the other way around? So it's not the issue of weight gain, it's that we have estrogen dominance, insulin resistance, and then we gain weight versus, so like weight gain basically being the symptoms.
Oh, yes, I completely agree with that. Like, I think that is totally true. And I think that when we're talking about weight gain as being a symptom, I continually think of inflammation. And we don't really know, for the most part, we're not really even sure, like, what is inflammation? Like, what does that even mean? And so when you think about inflammation throughout your body, we're talking about what it's unseen. And so when you think of, like, you get a cut on your arm and it starts to, starts to heal or whatever, it looks inflamed, it looks red, it's kind of itchy, it's sore, whatever, it hurts. That's essentially inflammation on the inside of your body too. We just can't see it. And inflammation, I think, is at the root of so much of all of this, like so much of all of these hormonal imbalances. When you consider that, and most of it I consider to be just starting in the gut, because that's really, to me, the root of all inflammatory processes. But when you are eating foods that you're potentially sensitive to or allergic to, you have an inflammatory response that happens in your gut. And so it's like you scratching that cut on your arm every single day, it's never going to heal. So it's the same thing if you're eating something, or you're chronically stressed, for instance, because stress also does a number on your gut. It actually increases cortisol, or increased cortisol production actually weakens the lining of your gut. So you could develop leaky gut. So point is that if there's food or there's a chronic stressor in your life, that is going to trigger this inflammatory response in the body, and you are going to just be perpetually inflamed. And that inflammation is a big part of weight gain, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, like when you take, when, for instance, if you were to do an elimination diet, that would likely take away a lot of those stressors on your body, and your inflammation will subside significantly. So I don't know if I'm totally answering your question, but I feel like it's really multifaceted. And, it's like we were saying before, you really have to take a nuanced approach when it comes to each person's health, because there are multiple reasons why someone might be, putting on weight and unable to lose it, or just are putting on weight, period.
Yeah. Well, and sugar is one of the most inflammatory foods, like across the board,
Yeah.
We used to use it as a spice, and now it's like the staple of our diet. But what I wanted to ask is, as I've been reading these, these studies on like how people in bigger bodies are not given the same medical treatment, they use the example of like thin people get joint pain too,
Yep.
but if someone overweight does, they chalk it up to weight. And so I'm wondering if they've also thought to look at or measure count thin women who also have a lot of fat cells, right? They call them in the medical literature, like, it's not medical literature. I think Dr. Mark Hyman calls them like thin on the outside, fat on the inside.
Right. Yes.
And so I'm wondering if they've measured, if they're estrogen dominant as well, but they may not have weight gain, but they may get some of the more like serious, and I don't want to say it's more serious, but more life-threatening issues like breast cancer that is estrogen dominant. I want to kind of like flesh that out for people. Like, it's not always your weight. It could be other, like you could be thin and still be having, or average weight, you could still be eating sugar and not realizing, or any issues that cause estrogen dominance, as you described above, and it still be affecting you, even if you're not gaining weight.
Yes, absolutely. I could not agree with that more. I think that there are plenty of people who are considered skinny or whatever who have major health issues. I mean, you can certainly be inflamed, you can have insulin resistance, you can be pre-diabetic and not be overweight, or what's considered to be overweight. So for sure. And so much of that, I think, comes back to the fact that it's not only sugar, of course, it's other inflammatory foods like the inflammatory omega-6s. They lead to chronic inflammation that leads to all the things, whether it's joint pain or menstrual cramps or whatever. I think in the book, what I was going for was that I wanted people to understand that, that's a potential risk factor. And so if you are overweight, then it is something to consider with regard to if you have, these estrogen dominant type symptoms, whether it's the ongoing bleeding or, really heavy painful periods. So that's what I was thinking about. But I agree completely that it doesn't matter what size you are. You're certainly not immune to having any of these issues if you have dysregulated blood sugar, runaway inflammation, you have gut health related issues, or your liver is not detoxing the way it's supposed to, on a normal, healthy basis.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm trying to learn myself. So, because I'm like, oh my God, I never thought to ask some of these questions. So I appreciate you fleshing that out for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to take a break from our sponsor. And when we come back, I want to ask you about some solutions and your perspective on the mind-body connection for period problems. So we'll be right back.
Okay.
Are you ready to take action from this insatiable season and experience what it's like to be free of sugar cravings? Enter Freedom from Cravings, a 5-week live group coaching program that starts right after Memorial Day. If you've ever wondered why you can eat healthfully but still have a 3 p.m. crash that sends you, even more frequently in our quarantine times, to your cabinet for chips or peanut M&Ms, or why you can be good all day and then overeat popcorn or coconut ice cream while watching Netflix at night, Sugar Rehab will show you how sugar cravings are a biology game, not a willpower or discipline game. Generic advice from magazines or nutrition experts doesn't take into account your unique biology and history. You need to learn where you fall on the vegetarian, Mediterranean, paleo continuum to learn what healthy and good foods are for you. This will help to prevent sugar cravings, no white knuckling required. Rehab programs for other forms of substance abuse focus first on the detox portion to free the body from chemical dependency before delving into the emotional and spiritual reasons for addiction. Likewise, in Freedom from Cravings, we'll focus on the physical and chemical dependency elements of food to clear the way for subsequent work and focus on the deeper-seated issues that may make you turn to food. I'll be personally guiding you through experiences and experiments to determine what your biology needs are to not only prevent sugar cravings all day and at night, but to also feel satiated, focused, optimistic, and energized. Be prepared to be surprised and redefine what healthy means for you and your body. Registration for Freedom from Cravings runs May 18th through May 25th. Save $50 if you register by May 22nd. Enter coupon code EARLYBIRD to save $50. Sign up at alishapiro.com to get on my list so you don't miss out on the early bird savings or this live program that I only will run once this year. We are back with Nicole Jardim, author of Fix Your Period. So Nicole, we kind of ended before the break talking about kind of weight biases and and basically estrogen dominance, all this stuff. Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that I see a lot of reasons why people turn to sugar with their periods is the pain from especially something like endometriosis. And you in your book describe a lot of, the hormonal issues with various things. So people definitely read the book. And I'm curious though, do you think there's an emotional metaphor there as well? And I know that, you described in the first half of our interview about how so much of our hormones plays into how we feel anxious or tired or whatever, or the mood swings, right? But I'm curious kind of I don't know if this is a metaphysical question or whatever, but I'm curious your perspective on what is the pain trying to teach us beyond blood sugar balance, thyroid, hormonal stuff?
Oh, this is so good. I really do think, coming back to what I was saying earlier about our belief systems around our periods, our menstrual cycles, being a woman in this patriarchal society, I think it's our bodies are literally shouting at us. They're like, lady, I need you to pay attention to what is happening here. And, when you think about the fact that we live in a society or in a world where you can go to the doctor, and if you have a lower back pain, for instance, or you have chronic migraines, that your doctor is going to make a reasonable effort to help you and help you address the problem. But in many, many cases, when you go to the doctor, especially as a female who has pain related to their menstrual cycle, your uterus is causing you problems, that's not taken seriously. It's perpetually normalized. So I think that many women are caught in a cycle of medical gaslighting, so to speak. And that we're not taken seriously, or our health concerns are not taken seriously. I mean, I've heard from women that they have been laughed at by their doctors. They've been shouted at. They've been told to get out of their offices. They've felt like they had to bring their husbands, their boyfriends, their sons into their doctor's office so that they will take their menstrual related pain seriously enough. I've had women go into the ER, for pain like this, endometriosis pain, and be dismissed, be given a painkiller and sent home without any further examination. I mean, this is a crime against humanity as far as I'm concerned. And this is a collective problem. We are collectively feeling the pain of so many women whose needs have been ignored. And I just think that we're at the point now where women are literally demanding better care and answers. And they're no longer even just asking for it. They're just I think we're on the verge of a full-on revolution in women's health, because we're at the point now where it's not acceptable. It is just not okay anymore. For, when you think back to 50 years ago when, symptoms, premenstrual symptoms, PMS, premenstrual syndrome is what they call it. I prefer to call it premenstrual symptoms because that's really what they are.
I like that.
Right? Because do we all really have a syndrome before our periods every month? I don't think so.
It's so sneaky how that language that we assume isn't harmful is,
right?
We're so surrounded by harm around our bodies. We don't even know to oh yeah, I have a syndrome.
Exactly.
I never thought of that.
I know. And I think it's good for some of us because then we have, at least if we have a diagnosis that's helpful for us for a roadmap to treatment. But for the most part, I don't know how helpful some of these diagnoses are or the labels are. And I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I think that, so much of what we can do that's within our control will help those symptoms dissipate or completely disappear in many cases. And then you don't have a syndrome anymore. So how does that work exactly? I think that it's immensely disempowering to just slap a diagnosis on so many women when they have a lot more control over the symptoms that they're experiencing than they believe. It's just all about informed consent and knowing, what all is out there to help treat the thing. And usually it's just pharmaceuticals. And as a result, like that to me inherently takes the power away from someone because they're like, oh, well, now I have to take this pill for the rest of my life. And if I don't, then I'm going to have these horrible, horrible symptoms. And I'm just at the mercy of my terrible body who's rebelling against me for reasons I have no idea why. Like, are you kidding me? That narrative has got to go. It drives me crazy because I just hear this disempowerment story over and over again. And we have got to change that.
I know. And I know what you were talking about, like I might get in trouble, but there's this, again, nuance and complexity I've seen with so many clients, like it's so helpful to have a diagnosis for something, to your point. And yet if you take that diagnosis as a symptom instead of the root cause, you can start to unpack. And I've found that with my clients, we start on the food and emotional level, and then it gets deeper, and they're able to then release that very identity of their diagnosis by understanding the root causes. I mean, it takes a while. I've had clients being like, I always thought I was a depressed person, and now I realize I'm not a depressed person. Or,
so amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it's
like life altering.
Yeah. I mean, it's this weird, spiritual journey of I need to know what's happening. I need a label for it. And then I need to look at it through a different level of awareness, right? To have that empowerment, and it can be a messenger rather than, and I'm thinking about clients who had period problems, like one client who didn't have a period and then got one. And she again, we worked on her binging and stuff, but then once that pain was stabilized and she was able to really implement a lot of healthy things, it was like, oh my God, there's trauma here around adoption, or one client I've worked with endometriosis, it was like, okay, once we've stabilized, realizing that this food binging isn't about willpower, it's like, oh, I have some stories about sex and sexuality being dangerous, so have you seen that? These deeper layers of, and it doesn't mean it applies to everyone, but it's just been so surprising to me because people start to intuitively know what the next step of healing is. I'm not telling them, they're telling me.
Right. Oh, that is so cool. And I love that you've brought this out because that was kind of where I was going to go next with this, is that when we think about childhood trauma, especially against females, what is it? 1 in 3 girls are sexually abused as children, and then 1 in 3 women are going to be raped at some point. I believe those are the numbers. I may be slightly off, but it's close enough that it's an astounding amount of people. And when you look at the numbers as it relates to something like endometriosis, for instance, and I don't have the exact number, but one of the studies that I found was that I think it was somewhere between 35 or 45% of women who have endometriosis have sexual trauma in their lives, meaning that there was sexual abuse at some point. And again, astounding numbers. And so what is it about, what is happening to us in our childhood or even in our adult lives that is potentially triggering these symptoms as they relate to our menstrual cycles, our reproductive organs, our reproductive function? I think it's huge. And it might not even only be sexual trauma. It might be a traumatic experience with a gynecologist, for instance, or a traumatic birth. And that can trigger all kinds of problems. And so it is really interesting to me. There isn't a ton of research on it, but it's becoming, really, right? I know, but it certainly is becoming more prevalent. And it's interesting because I thought about this. I was like, how can I write a book about this? But I ain't writing another book again anytime soon. That's another story, but that's my own trauma. But I do really think that this is something that 100% has got to be explored. And it really isn't being explored. And we are, like what you said about, like, what's the pain actually telling you? And besides blood sugar and the cortisol problems. And of course, those are just physical manifestations of mental and emotional traumas, right? Or mental and emotional issues. And so what are those mental and emotional problems? Like, where are those coming from? Like, is it from a stressor that you have currently in your life? Or is it a stressor that you have that you perceive to be far worse than it is? Or is it something that we don't even know about that's been suppressed and happened to you as a child even, that is just replaying in your subconscious and triggering problems, and you have no idea how to get to the root of it?
Yeah. And I think it's so brave for people who want to go there. I'm reading right now the memoir by Chanel Miller, she was the woman who was raped by Brock Turner. I think it's called Know My Name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I heard people recommend the memoir, and I actually didn't know what it was about, but I'm into memoirs right now. Yeah, it's called Know My Name. And she describes like how, like, going to court, like, she didn't realize it was going to be this whole thing, but like sitting there enraged for her because of how the system then traumatizes you again. And so it's like, no wonder that women, like, there's no studies on this and it's just tamped down. And like, so many of my clients are like, around their periods, like they just eat sugar to like numb out to all this stuff because it's not safe in most places to bring it up. And this book is just making me realize like how horrible our culture is to women and women's sexuality and everything related to it. It's like, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's like exactly what you're describing. Like, it needs to be studied and we need to honor it and like recognize that there's some connection.
Yes. No, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I do tend to focus more on, like you said, the tangible things that are pretty much low-hanging fruit that are relatively easy for a lot of us to start to implement, whether that's, dietary changes or introducing whatever, a meditative practice, whatever that is, because a lot of the time there are extenuating circumstances that can feel very much out of our control, or things that have happened to us that we're not really ready to face yet. And I do think that healing is incremental.
Oh, yeah. I mean, trauma is right, like too much too fast. And if you can't heal too much too fast, it's like you have to do slow and steady. So, slow and steady is safe, right? I mean,
Yes.
But yeah. And I think food and hormonal and focusing on the food first sends the body such a daily sense of safety.
Yes.
But then it's like, then we can handle these bigger things that are unfolding.
So true.
And yeah. And so what are some, and again, you have a program that's going along with your book and you address it in the book, but what are some of like the easy, low hanging fruit, as you call them, low sugar, no pun. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
But what are some easy steps that people, once they start to recognize, oh, my period is not bad, it's not annoying, it's not all these things, it is a vital sign like blood pressure. You would never say my blood pressure is so annoying.
True.
Right.
Right.
How can people start? Like, what you think is the low hanging fruit?
I think that there are so many things, first of all, and it can feel so overwhelming. This is why, part of the reason why I wrote the book was because I wanted everyone to understand that, the interconnectedness of our body allows for, like you said before, right? Like, it allows for so much change to happen from relatively small interventions, so to speak. And when we already know the problems, like we know that hormones become disrupted by, food that is not great for our bodies, doesn't work for our metabolism, food that is inflammatory in nature, as well as, blood sugar imbalancing type foods, as well as environmental chemicals and the amount of stress that we're under if it's all unmitigated and we're not addressing our stress. And, there's like so many things that contribute to this. So we already, like you said before, right? We already know the answer, or we know the solution because we already know the problem. And it's just a matter of implementing changes in a strategic way. And so I think one of the first things that I always have women start to think about is what's happening with their digestion. Because if there was ever something that has been completely normalized in our society, I would say that gut health problems are it. I mean, like, we have 100 million people with some kind of gut related issue. And it's just, there aren't really a whole lot of solutions. And so in speaking from that root cause perspective, Like, what can you do that's so easy, that's kind of hard, but so easy to start? And one of the things I have women do is to start to chew their food, because a lot of people are making a valiant effort, right? They're bringing better foods into their meal, into their diet, and, they're consuming veggies and whatnot. And yet, they're still having these issues. And so I always say, well, like, how many times are you chewing a mouthful of food? And I know this is so basic, but it really is a big problem. And if you're not chewing your food properly, you're literally unable to digest carbohydrates properly. You are not able to digest protein properly because your stomach doesn't have time to produce enough stomach acid in response to food coming down the esophagus. I mean, there are so many aspects to this. And if you think about it, like I said, from that root cause perspective, it is the very beginning of digestion. Yeah. And if you want to digest your food properly, meaning that you want to absorb all the nutrients in it, which I hope you do because you're probably spending a lot of money on your food, then that's really where you have to start. And so I'm always encouraging women to chew their food 20 to 30 times a mouthful. You will be amazed by how much less stomach pain you have if you do, less heartburn. And yes, and satiation. Exactly. Like, you will definitely feel fuller faster and eat less. So you won't have that stuffed feeling at the end of your meal. And your hormones will start to regulate. I will never forget. It's one of the first things I recommend in my program. And I kind of coach women through it. And we literally chew together because I'm like, well, you got to learn. And what's so interesting is that the responses from so many women over the years. I mean, I had one client who'd said to me, the one thing she really did was she brought some leafy greens into her diet, but the chewing of her food was her biggest thing. And she was so amazed because she started having more and more regular periods. And she was like, this is really the only thing I've done. And so that's, to me, it's like such an incredible response to something that's so simple, is that your hormones might start to regulate themselves just because you're now practicing. It's almost like a meditative practice in a way when you're eating your food, because I always say that the food that you eat is so important, but the way in which you eat it is also just as important. And so we are typically a society that eats standing up, or we're eating in the car, or we're running out the door and we're eating something, or we're on the subway or whatever. And that is certainly no way to let your body know that it's in a safe environment and it can absorb those nutrients. Because if we're in a stressed environment and we're eating, the body usually does one of two things. It either just gets all blocked up and constipated, or it just dumps everything really fast and you end up having chronic diarrhea. So I think that that's one of the first steps. And then with regard to food in general, like I'm a big fan of this. I call it the 3x3 method. And really all it is 3 servings of veggies in 3 times a day, or 3 meals a day. And so I just have people start with like half a cup of raw vegetables, which is nothing. So basically 1.5 cups of veggies, whether that's 1.5 cups of raw kale, or it's, and you cook it down, or it's 1.5 cups of like salad veggies, peppers and cucumbers and all these things. And you just throw it all into a bowl, and with some protein and a carbohydrate. So like, this to me is one of the easiest ways that we can just start to measure the amount of healthy, like nutrient dense foods that are coming onto our plate. And I always ask people to send me an email. Let me know how you feel after 10 days of doing this. And guaranteed, people feel remarkably better. So I think that, when we're talking about those kinds of things, those are relatively easy to do and you will see results. I think another thing too, with regard to estrogen dominance in particular, and the fact that so many of us are in that boat, that we want to be focused on the cruciferous vegetables. And so cruciferous vegetables contain a compound called DIM. They also contain a compound called SGS. And so all of these compounds basically support the 2 phases of liver detoxification. And your liver plays a really crucial role in your hormones, because it actually not only breaks down toxins that pass through your blood, but it breaks down hormones that have been used so that they can be passed through the bile into your gut and released from your body, literally flushed down the drain. And so what happens is, if our livers, those 2 phases of detoxification, if they don't have the right nutrients to support them, it's almost like the raw materials to just support a process that's happening, like to build something. If we don't have that, it's going to be subpar. And so that detoxification process won't work as well. It's almost like, at a processing plant of some kind, like a garbage processing plant, things just keep falling off of the conveyor belt. And that's really kind of what happens with your liver too. So those hormones might not be broken down properly, or they might just be recirculated back into your body. So when we get those cruciferous vegetables in, especially something like broccoli sprouts, which are so potent, then we will really help to support that liver detoxification, that conveyor belt, to get those used up hormones out of your body so that they don't recirculate and cause even more of a problem. So I feel like those are a few of the things that I recommend to people as a basis.
I love that I think I interrupted you on accident when you were saying about less heartburn. I remember one of my first clients, like this was 13 years ago, we worked on chewing her food and she got off her heartburn medication. Like I didn't even know that was like possible. I was so just helping people get off processed foods. And like her doctor of like 10 years was shocked. Like that was when I was starting to be like, what's going on here? Like this simple stuff, and I've since now realized how crazy we view, eating and all this kind of stuff that is normal is to me, we have to unnormalize normal. But I'm so glad you brought up those tips because they're so easy. And green, especially you mentioned so much of the greens, that bitter flavor helps also prevent sweet cravings. Like in Chinese medicine, the bitter flavor, rather than going from salty to sweet, when we add a bitter, pungent, and astringent, it helps with those. So I'm so glad you mentioned this because they're simple, right? We don't need to build food up any more than it already has become.
Oh, I know. And also I think that we think based on, again, I think it's the current paradigm that we need a great deal of medical intervention to feel better, or we just need to make huge efforts to start to feel better. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, most of the time, the women who've come to me, they've not made significant enough changes that, it's interrupted their whole life. Instead, they've made smaller changes and they start to see quite big improvements. And so I think that we all, it's hopeful for a lot of people if they're not feeling like they, that they have to, totally turn their lives upside down. And also too, like with blood sugar, for instance, magnesium is an amazing supplement and it's multifaceted in that it's really supportive of your menstrual cycle as well. But it's also, it's super supportive of bowel movements. So it's going to support you if you have constipation. Magnesium, interestingly, becomes depleted by certain changes in female sex hormones. So in the luteal phase, it actually is depleted compared to in the follicular phase, which is potentially why PMS symptoms and things like bloating and migraines and pain happen in that second half of your cycle. So the magnesium-rich foods that we were just talking about, the leafy greens like kale and spinach and Swiss chard and things like that, and of course the healthy fats like almonds and other nuts like cashews and seeds and things like that, as well as avocados have high magnesium too. So whatever we can do to, like anything that we can just add into our meal, even if the meal isn't, like the greatest quality and you're just not super in love with what it is you're eating, especially right now when things are just not available, think about the frozen foods aisle as well, because all of that has been packaged when it was fresh and now it's just frozen. And so it's still retaining a lot of the nutrient density. And you can just like bring little bits into your meals and that will start to move the needle on your health.
Yeah, no, I love that. And doing that, even if you're like, feel like you're having an off day, like still eat the vegetables, right? Still chew your food because it doesn't take much more effort and it will help get, what people call is back on track, I think as well. One other question I have, part of when we do get into that perimenopause phase between like 35 and 50 is what you said in the book, which I was like, oh, okay. I'm firmly in the middle.
You're in the middle, girl. I know. I'm 40. So yes, I'm right there with you, sister. Yeah.
I know that, our periods can be more all over the place. Our hormones can be. And two questions. One, I heard that perimenopause is like on an emotional and soul level, similar to like the PMS week in terms of how we feel hormonally often, in terms of being more discerning, kind of saying like, what's going on here? Do you ascribe to that? And two, are there things that we can do to kind of normalize the degree that they feel all over the place? Or is it, we just got to buckle up and do the best we can?
Oh my gosh. I love this. It's so good. I find this fascinating because I actually wrote about this in the book where I talked about Dr. Christiane Northrup in her book, Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, which is like a Bible.
Yes, I read the whole thing. I know it's a reference book, but I love it.
Okay, that is incredible to me because I have certainly not read the whole thing, but it is unbelievable. And and she speaks about this idea that the veil is lifted in that second half of your cycle. And I freaking love that metaphor because I feel as though that's exactly what happens. It's almost, I kind of liken it to progesterone is like truth serum, or it's like Windex because you can clean your glasses and see things way more clearly than you did when estrogen was high and kind of blinding you with its niceness. And, I really think that though, in the second half of your cycle, it really is incredible to see that shift. Like after ovulation happens and progesterone takes over, it's, it cocoons you in a way. It keeps you like warm and cozy, but it also makes you, like you said, super discerning. And you become acutely aware of things that are not working in your life. I cannot tell you how many women have said to me, I'm ready to divorce my husband in the second half of my cycle. And okay, we'll determine how much of that is real and how much it isn't. But it is, things are brought to the forefront for you that you were not necessarily paying attention to in the first half of your cycle when you had a different hormonal makeup happening, really. And so I think that it's very important for us to really tune into that. It's intuition, really, is what it comes down to. And, we've been, for the most part, kind of told that that doesn't really matter so much and to look outside of ourselves. But I think that there's a lot of wisdom to be gleaned in the second half of our cycle. So journaling and paying attention to, people, relationships, stories, job situations, all of these things in our lives that are potentially not working. It's a great time to do that. And I would say that the perimenopause time is certainly very much like the luteal phase in that you are, first of all, I think that so many of us are just coming into our own at this time. It's interesting because I used to think when, I was obviously really young, my parents were in their late 30s, early 40s, and I just thought they had it all figured out because that's apparently what parents kind of lead you to believe. And then now I'm 40 and I'm like, oh my God, how did my mom do what she was doing? Like, I have no idea. And I just think it's so funny because we don't really have it all figured out, obviously. But this time in our lives, am I allowed to swear?
Of course.
Okay. Because I think that we give a lot less fucks as we get older. And I know. And as a result, I just think that like as you move through your 40s, there are less of those to give. And you really move into that place of knowing who you are and you know what you stand for and your belief system. And you're a lot less rattled by, other people's opinions and thoughts and, their actions. And you're able to stand in your own power in that way. And I've definitely noticed a shift in my life in the last 5 years for sure. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too.
Oh, yeah. In fact, part of why I wanted to do unmedicated childbirth was because I didn't think I could do it. And I felt intuitively like it would help me give less fucks. And it has.
Really?
Yeah. It felt like an initiation of like, it would bring me to the brink of like what I thought I couldn't do.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, it intuitively felt like that was true for me. And I mean, look at me even trying to explain it. Like, I'm just going to put a period there. That was my experience. But it's hard because part of, I think, my strength is I'm open to multiple points of view and discerning. But sometimes that leads to me watering down what I think or say. Because it's kind of like I'm allowed to have my viewpoint as much as I'm open to other people's, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah.
It definitely does.
So yeah, I find myself becoming what I guess people might say. I mean, I don't think it's unhinged, but sometimes I'm like, I'm going to talk about this right now because I want to talk about it,
As we should. And I think that, unfortunately we are right in this modern time that we're all living in right now. It's a bit of a powder keg. I mean, it's hard to just have, oh my gosh, it's kind of like a cesspool out there.
I was like, are we in a collective perimenopause stage?
I know, right? I know. Are we about to to make the transition? I do wonder. And again, I want to know more about the hormones in, as you progress through perimenopause and into menopause that, shift you to the point where you are no longer, you do not give any of those fucks at all. Like you're just like, this is who I am and I'm fully owning it and I'm living in my truth all the time. And I do think that that has to do with the hormonal shifts that happen and also with, just with age and
And realizing that normal is so effed up, like that to me is kind of like, what was I ever like conditioned to think? I don't, that's kind of where I'm at. Like normal is crazy.
It is. Yes, I know. What is normal? Like what we should be questioning that.
Oh my God.
And what is your normal? I mean, because we are subscribing to this reality that doesn't necessarily fit what it is that we desire, but this is what we've been told we should do. And we're sort of pushed down the chute. And before we know it, we're 45 and having the proverbial midlife crisis. And I just think that we can avoid that if we tune into the lifted veil time more often, tune into what our desires are during that time of our cycle.
Or we'll still have it and we'll have the power to change it because we've been doing it all along.
Yes. Right?
Yeah.
So true.
And then the last question was just about as we move into this stage and our hormones are fluctuating, right? I guess maybe that's part of the ride is building capacity for this like disorientation. Is there a way though that we can manage? So the like, I'm thinking specifically like, is there a way I can better manage so that my sleep feels a little bit more consistent or, whatnot? I guess, is there a way to support the degree of fluctuation at this time of life?
In perimenopause. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier about the hormonal life cycle and hormonal resilience is very much dependent on what we're doing in our teens, 20s, and 30s. And if you are, for instance, if you're not ovulating consistently in your 20s and 30s, or even your teens as well, because you're on hormonal birth control that's suppressing ovulation, that is going to have an impact on your health in later years. First of all, it can interfere with your ability to conceive, and it can also, it can cause ongoing fertility issues, as I have seen multiple times over in my own work. And I think the second thing is that when you're not ovulating consistently, you're not making these protective sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, at levels that are going to sort of fill up your hormonal bank, I suppose you could say. But the point is that in order to be hormonally resilient and to, move into this time in your life where there is a lot of fluctuation, you have to be making a concerted effort to, be ovulating consistently. So hopefully every month or every cycle, and making a reasonable effort to get food into your belly that is healthy and it's going to support your hormones, and figuring out like how to mitigate the stressors or the effects of stress in your life. And, it's not that hard, but I understand it is hard because our society isn't really set up for us to do that easily, which is so unfortunate. So we're working against some things, but I do believe that is one of the most critical things we can do to make sure that perimenopause is not this rough ride. Because I cannot tell you how many times I just had a woman yesterday on Instagram tell me that she said something along the lines of like, I'm in perimenopause. I think I am. That's another thing. People are very confused what perimenopause is too. And it's really just like you said, a time frame that begins from 35 to somewhere around 50 to 52. And you're fully in menopause when you have not had a period for longer than a year. So that perimenopause time is just a time frame, but you could go through all of perimenopause and be completely fine. And someone else might go through it and have these crazy hot flashes, have flooding periods that come twice a month. You just don't really know what you're going to get. And so much of that is determined by what's been going on for the last 2 decades. And also, what your genetics are saying, like, do you detox estrogen effectively or not? Are you making progesterone effectively? Are your ovaries working properly? Are you releasing an egg? All of these factors play a role in what your perimenopause experience is going to be like. But I just want to say as a final note that even if you are in perimenopause and things really suck right now and you're resigning yourself to the fact that this is just how it's meant to be and your life is doomed for the next however many years that you have a period, just know that is a complete falsehood. That is not true. You can apply every single thing in my book because to me, those are the basics for any period related problem, no matter what decade you're in, that you can apply and start to feel better. So I think that we have to know that. We have to know that we're not doomed to like period purgatory for the foreseeable future because we're in perimenopause and we're having a hard time at like 41. At 43, you could be having a better time.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's still like 9 years of suffering that I don't want
Yeah,
people.
that's
And
horrible.
again, yeah, and always, I think all of this health stuff is like what we're really curious about is like, who will we become when we embark on this? And yes, it'll be great to be like you'll unlock so much power that you can bring into the second half of life and really believe, I think, unlearn the story that like you're done at. Now I think it's like in a patriarchal culture, it's basically like, oh, you're invisible once you can't procreate. And I mean, we talk about it in terms of beauty, but it's like, that's what they're kind of hinting at, it's like, no, learn about it now so you can bring that power and momentum into wherever you are, because that's what I love about your book. It's like, that's what when I was reading it, I was like, this is about your period, but like, it's applicable to anybody who's basically like 10 to 52.
Pretty much. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I know I really wanted it to be that way. And I've had multiple people say, is this applicable to perimenopause? And I want everyone to know that perimenopause is not some sort of cliff that you fall off of at 35 and then you're just like hanging off the side for another 15 years. It's basically the same between 35 and 41, 42-ish. Things are for the most part the same for everyone. I mean, some people, if they're really, really stressed and things are not going well in their lives and they're not taking care of their health, they're likely going to have more symptoms. And that, again, is just a stark reminder for all of us that your menstrual cycle is indeed a reflection of your overall health. And if you are managing your overall health okay, perimenopause time is likely going to be just fine. Again, there are some exceptions to that rule, of course, but for the most part, I want everyone to not feel so much fear around these transitional times in your lives, because it's just like puberty. Remember when you were 12 and your period felt all over the place and you leaked through your school uniform or whatever it was? It's just your endocrine system trying to get its bearings and try and figure out okay, we have to ovulate every month now. And it's the same thing on the flip side with perimenopause. It's just like, okay, we're winding things down now, and there are going to be some hiccups, but ultimately it should not be hell. Like, I really just don't believe it should be.
Yeah. And you just brought up a good point that I really learned in your book. And I mean, we will wrap up, but for people, when Nicole was talking about ovulation, just because you have a period doesn't mean that you're ovulating. And so she gets more into that in the book, but that's a really important point, I think, for people who feel like their period's all over the place and they think that their hormone, or if they think their period's healthy, but they're not ovulating. Your book really tuned me into that. I was like, oh, never really thought about that. So we're just counting if it's bleeding that we're having a period. So, but get the book because she explains that as well. And Nicole, where can people find you? Where can people get the book? We'll link to it on the show notes as well to your site, but where can people get the book, and then where can they find you on social?
Yes. So you can find my book at fixyourperiod.com. I made it super easy for everyone. And on there until April 28th, when the book is actually on sale, I have a number of bonuses. I have a free 14-day cleanse program. I have multiple handouts on a lot of different topics I cover in the book, like seed cycling and vaginal steaming and how to live in harmony with your cycle, just like what we were talking about earlier with the veil lifted time of your cycle. And then I also have an opportunity to win a spot in my live 8-week program that I'm offering in about a month or so. So there's multiple ways to get all the resources, purchase the book. And then on my website, NicoleJardim.com, I also have my period quiz if that's something that's interesting to you as well. And I've got video quiz results depending on the symptoms that you put into the quiz. So multiple ways to connect and to start to get help.
Wonderful. And what about your Instagram handle?
Oh, yes, Instagram. Yep, I'm on there too. Nicole. So I'm Nicole M. Jardim, Nicole Madeleine. And you can find me on there. And I'm constantly sharing every single day about all kinds of period-related problems, answering a lot of questions. And I also want to mention my podcast as well, The Period Party, which has, again, like anything under the sun you wanted to know about your menstrual cycle and hormones.
Yeah. And I've been on it. It's a super fun environment. Like, I feel like I really am just like, I don't know, chatting with a bunch of like well-informed girlfriends.
It's true. We should rebrand and call ourselves that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I have a lot of friends I love, but they're not well informed on health stuff. So, all right, Nicole, thank you so much for your time and writing such a great book. Again, Fix Your Period by Nicole Jardim, 6 weeks to banish bloating, conquer cramps, manage moodiness, and ignite lasting hormonal balance. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you, Allie.
Thank you, Health Rebels, for tuning in today. Have a reaction, question, or want the transcript from today's episode? Find me at allieshapiro.com. I'd love if you leave a review on Apple Podcast and tell your friends and family about Insatiable. It helps us grow our community and share a new way of approaching health in our bodies. Thanks for engaging in a different kind of conversation. And remember, always, your body truths are unique, profound, real, and liberating.